It started as a typical day, nothing out of the ordinary. But for Sarah, a young woman who had just moved to a quiet town on the outskirts, the moment she stepped into that old creaky house, something felt off. She couldn't put her finger on it, not at first. It was like the house itself was watching her, waiting for her to figure out what was wrong. The walls had a way of closing in, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. It was almost as if the place had a heartbeat, slow, steady, but undeniably present. The house had been her mother's. She'd inherited it after her mother's sudden passing, leaving her no choice but to return to the town she had left years ago, hoping to find some kind of closure. But instead, she was met with whispers, strange, unsettling whispers that echoed from the corners of the house at night. Never loud enough to make sense of, but enough to keep her awake, staring into the dark. The town itself wasn't much better. People stared at her with a mixture of curiosity and wariness, and there were those who, when they thought she wasn't looking, would exchange looks, hushed, fearful, as if they knew something she didn't, as if they were waiting for something to happen. And then there was the room. It was tucked away on the second floor, behind a door she had never noticed before, hidden in plain sight, as though it had always been there, waiting for the right moment. No one ever spoke about it, but Sarah couldn't ignore the strange pull she felt whenever she passed it. It was as if the room knew she was meant to find it, and the closer she got, the more urgent the feeling became. One evening, unable to resist any longer, she finally turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit room, untouched by time. Everything was still. But there, in the center, was a worn, leather-bound journal that seemed out of place. As her fingers brushed across it, an electric jolt shot through her, and suddenly, the air in the room felt heavier. She hesitated, but curiosity got the best of her. She opened it. The first page was a list of names she didn't recognize, but one stood out. Sarah. Her name, written in careful looping script, was the last on the list. Her heart skipped a beat. What was this? Why was her name in a book that was clearly older than her own life? Her eyes scanned further down the page, and her breath caught in her throat. Under her name, in bold letters, were the words, "Next." The room seemed to shift, the walls pressing in on her, the whispers louder now, like they were closing in on her. Sarah slammed the book shut and backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned to leave, but the door wouldn't open. She twisted the handle, panicked, but the door was stuck, locked from the inside. Then from the dark corners of the room, something moved. Someone was watching her. What did it mean? Who were those people? Why was her name there? And who was behind the door? The answers felt so close, but she couldn't reach them. Not yet. Will Sarah find out what's really going on in this town before it's too late? Or will the secrets of the house swallow her whole? Stay tuned. Sarah's breath came in short, panicked gasps as she struggled with the door, her fingers slick with sweat. It wouldn't budge. The room around her felt suffocating, the air thick and heavy, pressing against her chest. The whispering sounds, once faint and distant, were now louder, clearer. So close she could almost hear the words. They were unintelligible, like a chorus of voices rising from the depths of the house itself. Sarah tried to call out, but the words got caught in her throat. The journal, the name, next. What did it mean? Why her? She ran her hands along the edges of the door, desperate, her mind racing. She needed to get out. She needed to leave. But the longer she stood there, the more she felt herself becoming drawn into the house's sinister embrace. It was like the walls were pulsing, breathing along with her, as though they knew she was about to uncover something she wasn't supposed to. Her thoughts flashed back to the people in the town, the way they looked at her, like they knew something she didn't. She had tried to ignore it at first, chalked it up to small-town gossip or the strange ways of people who hadn't seen a newcomer in years. But now, the way they avoided her, the whispered conversations that fell silent when she entered the room, it felt wrong. She thought about her mother, who had always been so secretive about the house, about the town. There had been no mention of any strange happenings, no warnings, only a vague, stay away from the old places whenever Sarah asked about her childhood, but she'd never pressed further. Maybe she should have. As Sarah's mind spun, she heard a noise behind her, a soft, almost imperceptible click, like a lock turning. She froze. The door. It was opening. She spun around, her heart pounding, as she found the door slowly creaking back, revealing the darkness beyond. Her breath caught in her throat, a chill running down her spine. The whispers were gone, replaced by a dead silence that felt even more unsettling. She stepped back, her feet unsteady on the old floorboards, and turned toward the door once more. She had to go. She had to leave, but she couldn't help the pull, the weight of the room dragging her back in. What was it about this house that made her feel like it was calling to her? She had only been here a few days, but it felt like a lifetime, like the house had been waiting for her all along. Slowly, she took a step forward, then another, her legs trembling. She was on the verge of crossing into the next room when she heard a creak above her. She stopped, her eyes darting upward. The ceiling seemed to ripple, like it was alive, shifting beneath the weight of something or someone watching her. She wasn't alone. She couldn't be. Her thoughts raced, trying to make sense of it all. Her mind flashed back to the journal. Was it her mother's? Had she written those names? What was the connection to Sarah, to the people who had lived here before her? The journal's words echoed in her mind. Next. Next for what? What would happen if she stayed too long? Or worse, if she left? The tension in the air was thick enough to cut, and Sarah had never felt more trapped. The pull to explore deeper was stronger than ever, but fear was growing too. What if she wasn't meant to find the truth? What if the truth was more terrifying than she could imagine? As she stood there, frozen in indecision, the door slammed shut behind her, plunging the room into complete darkness. And then, from the shadows, a figure stepped forward, its outline barely visible. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The figure stepped forward, its shape barely discernible in the pitch-black room. Sarah's pulse thundered in her ears as she struggled to make out any details, her breath shallow. The silence was suffocating, wrapping around her like a heavy fog, and the hair on the back of her neck prickled with an instinctual, primal fear. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs refused to move. The figure seemed to draw closer, each step sending a cold ripple through the air, until the faintest outline of its form became clearer. It was a man, tall, gaunt, with eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. They weren't human eyes, not entirely. The light they emitted was unnatural, almost sickly, and the intensity of their gaze seemed to pierce through Sarah, digging into her very soul. She could feel her heart slowing, as if her body was slowly shutting down in the presence of something far beyond her understanding. Sarah. The voice was a rasp, low and gravelly, like it had been pulled from the depths of a long-forgotten grave. The words hung in the air, charged with a strange weight, like they carried with them a warning. Her chest tightened. How does he know my name, she wanted to ask, but the words wouldn't come. She had no answer to the question anyway. Everything that had happened since she arrived at the house felt like a series of fragmented moments, slipping through her fingers just as she thought she understood them. Why was she here? What was she meant to uncover? And most importantly, who or what was this? The figure took another step forward, and Sarah instinctively backed away, her back hitting the cold wooden door. It groaned under her weight, the sound of old creaking wood piercing the silence like a warning bell. The man didn't move any closer, but his eyes never left her. "The house has been waiting for you," he continued, his voice now laced with something darker, something that felt ancient. "The history runs deep here, much deeper than you realize." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The house, the journal, the strange whispers, all of it seemed to be part of something far larger than she could comprehend. The weight of his words settled on her chest like a stone, and she felt herself sinking under the pressure. She wanted to ask him who he was, what he wanted, but something inside her told her she wasn't ready for the answers. Not yet. A sudden shift in the air made her flinch. The light from the figure's eyes flickered, as if it were struggling to maintain its glow. She looked around the room, searching for something, anything, that could explain this madness. Her eyes fell on the journal she had left behind on the floor by the table, its pages slightly curled at the edges, the name written on its cover still fresh in her memory. Sarah. What did it mean? What was she supposed to do with this knowledge? The figure's eyes narrowed, and a cold chuckle escaped his lips. "You think you're in control," he murmured, almost as if reading her thoughts. "But you're not. You've always been a part of this. You're tied to the past, whether you like it or not." Her mind raced. What was he talking about? The town, the house, her mother's cryptic warnings, the journal with her name. There had to be a connection. Suddenly, the air seemed to grow even colder, and the figure stepped back, dissolving into the shadows. The glow from his eyes faded, leaving only the feeling of something ancient and malevolent still lingering in the room. For a moment, Sarah thought she was alone again, but the silence felt different now. It felt charged, like the entire house was holding its breath. She turned back to the door, her hand hovering over the knob. She knew she had to leave, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something crucial, something important that she had to find before it was too late. The journal was still there, waiting for her, its pages whispering her name. A sudden loud bang echoed through the house, louder this time, more violent. It sounded like it came from upstairs. Her heart skipped a beat. The pull to stay, to uncover the truth, was almost unbearable. But a voice deep inside her warned her that some things were better left undiscovered. Still, the bang came again, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps coming closer, and Sarah knew, without a shadow of doubt, that whatever was upstairs was no longer just a part of the house. It was coming for her. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Each step was deliberate, like they were being measured, calculated. Sarah's hand gripped the doorknob so tightly her knuckles turned white. She was frozen, her body locked in place as the house seemed to close in around her, the walls creaking and groaning like they were alive. The temperature had dropped again, an unnatural cold that seeped into her bones. Her breath came out in sharp, visible bursts, each one hanging in the air, before it vanished into the void of the room. She turned her head slowly, instinctively. The shadowy figure from before was gone. But something else had taken its place. The feeling of eyes watching her, waiting. The footsteps stopped just beyond the door. For a long moment, there was only the sound of her own ragged breathing, the silence between them thick and suffocating. Then, with a sudden crash, the door rattled violently, the wood shuddering in its frame. A low, guttural growl echoed from the other side, so primal, so filled with rage, it sent a shiver straight down her spine. Her first instinct was to run, but her legs wouldn't obey her. She was rooted to the spot, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear anything else. Another crash. The door was beginning to splinter at the edges. I can't let it in. I can't let it in. The thought came to her in a frantic rush, and she stumbled backward, trying to find something, anything she could use to defend herself. Her eyes darted around the room, but it was empty, save for the journal on the floor. The same journal that had drawn her to this house in the first place. Was there something in its pages that could help her now? Was there a clue she had missed? The door shuddered again, the wood groaning under the force. The growl from the other side grew louder, more urgent. It wasn't just a sound. It was a warning. Whatever was out there, it wasn't human. Her mind raced. The journal. She had to look. Maybe it was more than just a record of the house's history. Maybe it held the answer to what was happening here. What had happened to her mother? The pages, the words, the drawings, they all had to mean something. She reached for the journal, her fingers trembling as she picked it up. The pages felt strange under her touch, thick and worn, almost like they had aged in a way that didn't make sense. She flipped through them quickly, her eyes scanning for anything that could help. And then, at the very back, she found it. A drawing, a figure, much like the one she had seen earlier, its eyes glowing, its form twisted and unnatural. But this time, there was something more. A symbol, drawn in blood red, beneath the figure's feet. It looked like a seal, a warning. Her mind went blank for a moment as she tried to process what she was seeing. What was this? Why had her mother kept it hidden in the journal? Was this the source of the house's curse? A loud crash from behind the door shattered her thoughts. The wood splintered and cracked, the sound of something massive pushing against it. The growl had shifted now, deeper, almost human sounding, like a guttural rasp caught in the throat of something trying to speak. Sarah's breath quickened. She had to act fast. She looked back at the symbol in the journal, the strange red mark. Was it the key to stopping this? Her hand shook as she traced the lines with her finger, trying to feel some connection, something that might trigger an answer. Nothing. The door gave way with one final ear-splitting crash. Sarah's heart stopped. A shadowy figure stepped over the broken remains of the door. It was huge, far larger than any man she'd ever seen. Its body was twisted, contorted, as though it didn't belong in this world. Its eyes, those same glowing eyes, burned into her, a feeling of malice so intense that it was almost suffocating. And then, in a voice that sent chills crawling down her spine, it spoke. "You think you can escape? You think you can break free?" Before she could react, it lunged toward her, faster than she could process. Sarah stumbled backward, her feet tangling with the floor, but she was too slow. The figure's hand shot out, grabbing her by the wrist, its grip like iron. Her heart hammered in her chest as the world around her seemed to close in, and the darkness grew even deeper, even more consuming. The figure's grip tightened, dragging her toward the darkness that now seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm. Her mind raced as her body fought to break free, but every attempt to pull away only seemed to make the things hold stronger. Panic surged within her. There had to be something she could do. She couldn't just let it take her, whatever it was. But then, just as she was about to scream, the world around her flickered. For a split second, the house seemed to blur, the walls breathing in and out like a living entity. The pressure in the room shifted, the oppressive weight of darkness lifting for the briefest moment, only to come crashing back down. In that instant, Sarah thought she saw something, a flash of light, like a doorway opening in the middle of the room. Her heart skipped a beat. A way out. The figure too seemed to feel it, its head jerked to the side, its eyes narrowing with what could only be described as fear. The hand that held her faltered, loosening just enough for Sarah to take a sharp breath. She twisted in its grip, using the small amount of freedom to yank herself away, her feet finally finding the strength to push against the floor. Just as she broke free, the figure's growl turned into something that almost sounded like a shout, louder, angrier, and far more desperate. It reached out again, but Sarah was already moving. She bolted toward the strange light, hoping beyond hope that it wasn't some sick trick of the house. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she ran, her thoughts a blur of fear and confusion. But as her hands reached toward the light, something unexpected happened. The journal she had dropped earlier, still lying on the floor, flashed brightly, its pages catching the same eerie light. Sarah hesitated, her body swaying with uncertainty, but then something deep inside her pushed her forward. She had no time to question why she felt drawn to it. She picked it up, flipping through the pages with frantic fingers until she reached the last drawing, the one with the symbol. Before she could think, her hand slammed against it, pressing hard on the red ink. The moment her fingers made contact, the air around her grew colder, so cold it burned. She gasped, pulling back as the light intensified, flickering and blinding her. But the figure, it hadn't given up. It lunged toward her again, its growl growing louder and more frantic. But just as it neared, a sharp, crackling sound filled the room, and the light exploded in a burst of energy, sending a shockwave through the space. The figure staggered back, its form flickering like a broken projection. For a moment, it looked almost human, almost vulnerable. Then in an instant, it morphed again, growing larger, more grotesque, as though it was shifting between worlds. The very air around it seemed to warp, a heavy distortion hanging in the space like a broken mirror. Sarah stumbled back, her heart racing in her chest. She had no idea what was happening, but it was clear now that the journal, the symbol, something in this house, was fueling whatever this thing was. It wasn't just a haunting. It was something far older, far more dangerous than anything she could have imagined. And then, with a screeching wail that seemed to come from the depths of the earth, the creature's eyes glowed brighter, its mouth stretching impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged, blackened teeth. "Do you think you've stopped me?" it hissed. Its voice was sharp, venomous. "You've only awakened what was dormant." Nova knew he had to confront whatever it was that had been set in motion the moment Garrett died. The answers, he realized, lay not just in the journal, but in the place where it all began, the graveyard. He stood before it once again, the ground beneath his feet cold and hard. The whispers of the past seemed to stir in the air, and Nova could feel the weight of the land pressing down on him. He had come so far, but the truth still felt just out of reach. As he approached Garrett's grave, he could hear it again, the faint, chilling cry. It wasn't coming from the coffin this time, though. It was coming from beneath the earth. Nova's hands shook as he knelt down, his fingers brushing against the soil. And then, just as his fingers touched the ground, something moved beneath him. A sudden violent tremor shook the earth, and the ground cracked open. Nova fell back, his heart racing as the dirt around Garrett's grave began to shift. Someone was rising from the earth, and as Nova looked on in horror, the silhouette of a figure began to emerge from the grave, its eyes glowing with an unholy light. The air grew colder, and Nova could feel the darkness closing in around him. Whatever had been unleashed, whatever had been awakened by Garrett's death, was now coming for him, and there was no escaping it. The final moments of this nightmare were drawing closer, and the truth, whatever it was about to be revealed. The earth trembled beneath Nova's hands as the figure slowly rose from Garrett's grave, its form barely visible in the dim light of the moon. His heart pounded in his chest, and his mind raced for an explanation, but there was none. The figure, shrouded in darkness, was not entirely human, its movements jerky, unnatural, as though it were struggling against something unseen, something that bound it to this world. Nova's breath caught in his throat as he struggled to comprehend what was happening before his eyes. The figure's head turned slowly, its glowing eyes locking onto Nova's. There was no mistaking it now. This wasn't Garrett. It couldn't be. But it bore his face, twisted and distorted, a grotesque imitation of the man he had known. The features were familiar, yet unnerving, and the gaze that met his was filled with nothing but a hollow, endless void. Nova stumbled back, his mind spinning. Was this a trick? Was it some kind of hallucination brought on by the grief and fear that had consumed him? But the figure moved closer, and with each step, the ground beneath him seemed to grow colder, the air heavier. A voice, not Garrett's but something else, rasped through the stillness of the night. "You shouldn't have come, Nova. You've awakened what should have remained buried." Nova froze, his legs unsteady beneath him. He wanted to run, but something held him there, a pull far stronger than fear. The figure, or whatever it was, continued to advance, its every step sending a chill through the air. Why are you doing this?" Nova managed to ask, his voice shaking. "What are you?" The figure paused, tilting its head as if considering the question. "I am what Garrett was meant to become," it said, its voice a rasping echo of the man Nova had known. "And I am the price for your ignorance." Suddenly, the ground beneath Nova seemed to shift. The earth cracked open wider, and from the fissures emerged tendrils of darkness, like twisted roots searching for something, grasping for life. The graveyard, once a place of peace, was now a portal to something far darker, something Nova couldn't even begin to understand. He watched in horror as the dark tendrils wrapped around the figure, pulling it back toward the depths of the earth. But just as quickly as the figure had risen, it was dragged back into the ground, disappearing into the shadows. And for a moment, all was still. Then a voice spoke from behind Nova, a voice so familiar yet so distant. "You've unleashed something that was never meant to be disturbed, Nova." He spun around to find Clara standing there, her eyes wide with fear. But it wasn't the Clara he knew. Her expression was empty, hollow, and her once soft features were now gaunt, almost skeletal. Her body seemed to shimmer in the moonlight, as though she were no longer fully present in this world. "Clara, what's happening?" Nova's voice was desperate now, pleading for answers he wasn't sure he wanted. Clara's lips curled into a twisted smile, but her eyes remained void of any emotion. "You never should have asked questions, Nova. Some truths are too dangerous to know. Garrett was right to fear them." Nova's stomach twisted with dread. "What do you mean?" "What's happened to Garrett?" Clara stepped closer, her movement unnatural, as though she were being pulled by something invisible. Garrett sought knowledge that the dead should never possess. He didn't understand what he was awakening, and now it's too late for both of us. Before she could react, the floor beneath her feet cracked open. She stumbled backward, horrified, as a second figure, different, but just as horrifying, emerged from the shadows. Her heart stopped. The game was only just beginning. The new figure slowly emerged from the cracked floor, its form more monstrous than the last. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes, two dark pools of nothingness, seemed to see straight through Sarah. The faint, chilling whisper that had filled the air before now grew louder, as if the walls themselves were speaking to her. "You can't escape it," the voice croaked, echoing around the basement. "You've opened the door. Now, you belong to it." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she backed away from the creature, her fingers still clutching the box tightly. She wasn't sure if it was the light from the box or her own fear that was making her hands tremble. But one thing was clear. She had awakened something ancient, something that wasn't going to let her go without a fight. The creature, a grotesque version of what was once human, stepped forward with slow, deliberate movements. Its jagged mouth opened wide, revealing sharp, needle-like teeth. Sarah's mind raced, trying to process the enormity of what was happening. She couldn't outrun it. She couldn't fight it. But there was one thing left, one chance to stop it. She knew what she had to do. The journal. Her great-grandfather's journal had mentioned it. This exact moment. There was a ritual, a way to close the door she had opened, but it required a sacrifice. She could feel the weight of the box in her hands, the pulsating energy radiating from it. This wasn't just a box. It was the key to binding the creatures, trapping them forever in the world they had come from. She glanced at the creature, still advancing, its eyes hungry for her. But then, without warning, the light from the box flared up once more. The creature shrieked, a horrible, otherworldly sound that made Sarah's blood run cold. It staggered backward, its body convulsing, as if the very light was burning it alive. She realized then that it wasn't just the box that had power. It was the symbol. The ritual was simple. Open the box, focus on the symbol, and invoke the energy trapped inside. She had to act quickly before the creature could recover and strike. With trembling hands, Sarah set the box down on the floor and carefully traced the symbol with her fingers. She felt the power surge through her, through the very earth beneath her feet. The creature let out another screech, but it was too late. The light from the box intensified, filling the basement with a blinding glow. The shadows recoiled, the air crackled with energy, and in that moment, Sarah knew she was no longer just a bystander. She was part of something far greater than herself. The light enveloped the creature, its body writhing in agony as it began to disintegrate, breaking apart into nothingness. The air around Sarah hummed with a strange finality. Slowly, the creature's form vanished, leaving only a faint trace of smoke in the air. Sarah collapsed to her knees, the box flickering and finally going dark. Her body was exhausted, her mind overwhelmed with everything that had just transpired. She had won, but at what cost? As the dust settled, Sarah stood up, looking around the now quiet basement. The house felt different now, almost as if it were breathing with a sigh of relief. The weight of the curse had been lifted, but there was a lingering question in her mind. Had she truly ended it? Or was this just another chapter in a never-ending story? The sound of footsteps above broke her thoughts. She froze. The door creaked open, and a shadow appeared in the doorway. "Sarah?" It was her brother's voice. "What happened? Are you okay?" She couldn't answer him just yet. She knew the danger had passed, for now. But deep down, she understood one thing. There were forces at work far beyond her control, and she couldn't help but wonder if this was the beginning of something even darker, something far more dangerous than she could ever imagine. She glanced at the box one last time before slowly closing it. The symbol had faded, but the feeling of unease lingered, and with it, the chilling thought that maybe, just maybe, the story wasn't over. Not yet.